There's a problem that kind of interests me about ancient cities, in that when we think about ancient Greek and Roman cities, we think about like the Parthenon, the Colosseum. I assume if you've even heard of ancient Greek and Roman cities, these things come to mind. But this is something that kind of bothers me because I've been working in ancient cities for about 25 years now, since I was an undergrad. And the stuff that we excavated never really synced up with the stuff that everybody talks about. And this sort of bothered me. It's like looking at Dublin, looking at the Pro Cathedral or the Aviva. These are exactly the equivalents, and trying to understand the city of Dublin. It doesn't tell you very much, right? You can get lots of information, but it doesn't tell you much about how cities work. And this was a problem that kind of started to kind of bubble and annoy me. Clearly, I have no life if this sort of thing bothers me, but it has bothered me for a while. So what I wanted to do today was talk about some things that I'm working on, kind of show you how I'm working on it and why I'm thinking about it. It's a little bit more methodological, but I will have a case study. And my hope is, rather than telling like a neat story, just to kind of give you a sense from what I'm working on. And we're obviously quite limited by time. So if anybody's got questions, I mean, I'm happy to, you follow up either after or even just send me an email and we can arrange a chat about it. So it's a short talk, but I want to talk about sort of approaches and methodology, then look at a case study, and then talk about future directions. And my hope for that last section, which is only one slide, is just in case there's anybody in the audience who go, I know about that, I can help you, because there's lots of things about this that I have absolutely no idea about, and lots of things I do have an idea about. So this seems like a great forum for potential collaboration. So the key kind of considerations in my research as a whole are kind of the role of human agency or human actions in like sustaining urban populations. So looking at cities as a whole and trying to figure out how ancient people managed cities, and thinking about the relationship with humans and natural resources as well. The reason I choose ancient cities is, well, first of all, I have a background in classics, so why would I not? But also they're really useful data sets. Ancient cities give us a really long-term view of urbanization. So you can look at the beginning, the middle, and the end of an urban settlement in a way you can't really today, because Dublin hasn't collapsed yet, and we hope it doesn't collapse anytime soon. So they're useful models for thinking about that. The period that I generally work on is about 500 BCE or BCE in old money to 500 CE AD, whichever you prefer. But mostly I'm going to be talking something in the middle of that, around about zero-ish. So I hope it's clear enough, but we don't need to know an awful lot about it. So in working on ancient cities and excavating ancient cities in Greece, where I mostly work, as I said, the big monumental structures that we associate with the ancient past either aren't present or aren't present in a way that is meaningful. I spent most of my first excavation in this thing, digging a big Roman house, rather than some fancy temple. Now, this is interesting because it lets us think about cities. But what's more interesting about this, these are three projects that I have worked on or am working on the mainland of Greece. Stymphalos, the first one, is on a lake bed. And this was a lake bed in antiquity, but it's a very unusual karst geography, or geology, sorry. And this lake continuously floods and dries out. So I excavated it 1 year. The next year I came back to do more excavations and was completely underwater. I was last there about 5 years ago and it's completely and utterly dry. The entire lake dried up and it's since come back. And this was a phenomenon that happened in ancient times. If you're thinking about building a city, why would you build a city somewhere where you're not going to have reliable crops? Strange to me. Aegura is another one. That's a very high up city that had very, very major problems with water supply. It didn't have a natural water source, so they had to pipe it in at various times. Again, if you're building a city, it's kind of odd that you would not think about water as one of the basic needs. And then Cancria below, similarly had no natural water supply where I'm working, and wasn't fortified, so it wasn't defensive. The reason I'm telling you this is when we think of cities and what we think we need to have a sustainable city, it doesn't always stack up in the ancient world. They have different priorities and different interests, and that's, I think, something maybe we can learn from. So the main sort of data that I use is pottery. Pottery is, this is definitely Marmite. Like, people love pottery or loathe pottery. Most people fall into the latter category, but it's really important. In the ancient world, pottery was used as it is today. So your cups, your buckets, it's used for lamps, it's used for all kinds of different things. Once pottery, so fired clay, has been fired, it's basically indestructible. You can break a pot, but it's very hard to get rid of the broken bits of pot. And those broken bits of pot give us really useful data for trying to understand dates of a site, functions of a site, connections of sites with other sites, so you're getting things coming in from other sites. So it's really useful for that. So pottery is a data source, and it's also kind of a language that you need to learn to think about archaeological sites, especially in the Mediterranean. There's kind of three main ways of looking at pottery. You can either look at the decoration, which is, you can see here is kind of the more common way of doing it. You can look at the form and shape of pottery, which is typology. And then one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is looking at the characterization of pottery. So doing a geological analyses of pottery to try and understand where it's from. They all give you different pictures and ask different sets of questions. And I kind of think if you have this, you should try and ask all three types of questions if you can. So again, a big part of my research is just thinking more broadly about the types of questions we can ask. Let me just skip back for half a second. So this methodological toolkit that I flagged here, but entirely forgot to talk about, is something that I'm really big on. To ask more holistic sets of questions of ancient cities, we need to rely on different types of evidence. So you might get an ancient source telling you one thing. You might get pottery telling you another thing. You might get maybe ethnographic research, so looking at traditional practice telling you another thing. So for me, it's really important to pull as many of these strands together to try and tell a more holistic story about cities and thinking about sustainability. So the main data that I use is pottery, and the main data collection strategy that I use is archaeological survey. Now, when most people think of archaeology, I assume you probably think of people in a trench digging a hole, right? That's what most archaeology sort of looks like. But there's also archaeological survey, and that's sort of the surface exploration of areas. And the benefit to this is it's like, you know, you see CSI and they're looking for a body and everybody lines up and walks across the field. It's the same sort of thing. You line up and you kind of systematically explore a landscape and record all of the artifacts that you encounter in that landscape. Now, the benefit of this is it gives you a really long-term picture of an area, so a valley or a plateau or something. And it gives you, in theory, an unbiased sample. So if you sink a trench somewhere, you might accidentally hit a temple, which isn't going to give you a good sort of overview of the city, whereas a survey will give you a good overview of the city. Does that kind of make some sense? So you're recording everything that you encounter. Survey is useful, but it's not useful kind of by itself. It needs other things to make it more useful. Survey, I always think of like a telescope. It gives you a very big picture, but in kind of low resolution. And excavation is more like a microscope. It gives you a very small, focused, very high resolution picture. So survey provides the context and excavation provides the calibration, if that makes sense. So how does this work? I'll show you a case study and kind of walk through some of the things I'm looking at the moment with the time remaining. So this case study is the site of Knossos on Crete. And Knossos is one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. It's really well known for having the so-called Palace of Minos, this big Minoan palace, if anybody's seen. We get about 1 million visitors a year at the site. So it's a busy enough place to work. It's located in north central Crete. And you can see sort of the star where I've kind of tried to flag it. And then there's this sort of panoramic photo below. I don't know if everybody can see it or not. So it's just about 5 kilometers south of the island capital of Crete, Heraclio. So it's quite close to the coast, but it's in a valley. And I don't know if you can see it with the light or not, but can you see sort of an orangey, slightly sickly looking outline? Perfect. Okay. So that is the ancient city. The ancient city is buried almost entirely, except for a few monuments. And in the survey, we were able to map out this ancient city. And this footprint comes from the director of the survey that I work on, Todd Whitelaw. And this is sort of the extent of the ancient city. So it might just help you locate a little bit about the kind of things we're doing. Survey data is not always very accessible. It's very interesting, but not many people will look at this and say, oh my God, I got to get that book. So what it looks like, surveys, lots and lots of maps, and it's building up big, big, big patterns. And that's the point of it. So if you look at, will this work? If you look at this first one here, you can see the blue. The blue is representative of every piece of pottery we picked up in the Knossos Valley. And those are all mapped onto the map. So this is where we picked up every individual piece. And we had just over 400,000 pieces. So it's a very labor-intensive type of work. The black over top are various other categories of artifacts. And the reason I've kind of shown you these is just to show you what you can tell from this kind of map just by itself. So if you see here, marble veneers in this one. Marble veneers were a type of kind of luxury building product that the Romans would have used. So we get a cluster of that in this one part of the city, which leads us to believe that perhaps this is more likely to be an elite neighborhood, right? You might have sigillata, that's the type of imported pottery that's mostly coming from Italy in this case. So again, you can see kind of where network connections come into a city without having to dig or anything else. But this amphorae one is one that really interests me. So this has led me down a series of rabbit holes. So amphorae are clay vessels that are like the ancient equivalent of transport containers, shipping containers. They're clay vessels that were most often associated with moving wine or oil around the Mediterranean and more widely. They're used for lots of other things, but this is kind of the common thing we think of. And during this survey, it's a little hard to see in the map, but I've circled 3 big concentrations that we came up with. The one at the top, which is in the north, was mostly imported amphorae, and this is the part nearest the sea. So it's kind of interesting. We see lots of things coming in, maybe being distributed in something like a warehouse, and then being packaged and then sent off. So things like dried fruit from Campania, different types of wine, maybe salted wine from the island of Kos, and these are being distributed throughout the city. The one in the bottom, I'm going to ignore the one in the middle for now. The one in the bottom is local amphorae. And why this is interesting is that the bottom part of this map is the south of the city. And to the south of the city is where we have all the agricultural activity taking place. And so what I think we have here is agricultural goods coming into the city and then being packaged into these amphoras and sent off to other places. So this was like a hypothesis that came out of the survey that really interested me. That led me to, this is how sicknesses begin, by the way. That led me to becoming more interested in amphoras and more interested in how amphoras are produced and why and for what. And I started to work on this particular kiln site. I'm working on a range of these, but this is just a handy enough example. And this is a pottery kiln that was being used to produce these amphoras. It was excavated in the late 80s, and no one did anything with it. So the data was all there that I could use, which is fantastic. You don't have to excavate. When you excavate, you leave sites vulnerable to destruction. So it's kind of a sustainable approach to doing archaeology, like use what we have and try and get more information out of it. So I was using that. And then I was able to map these different types of amphoras that were being produced onto wider networks. So this was the classic type here that they're producing. It's a vessel. It has these 2 sort of long handles. And it's got a funny spiked bottom. The spiked bottom is meant to slot into the bottom of ships. So when it's going overseas, it won't like tip or smash or anything. The amphoras from Knossos were almost certainly associated with wine for reasons I can go into if anybody's interested, but they were almost certainly associated with wine and wine transport. You don't construct containers if you don't have surplus to ship, right? So by the fact that they're producing these suggests to me that they're producing more food than they need to sustain their population. So that's interesting in and of itself. In addition to the amphoras, we found these stands. Stands are just what says in the tin, they're used for standing amphoras in. Because amphoras have that thick toe, the thick toe is for shock resistance on these ships. You need a stand to slot it into to fill it. So if they're filling it with wine, you need these stands. But then we found beehive fragments. And this site, or 2 of these sites I'm looking at, I think of more beehive fragments than anywhere else in the ancient world, as far as I know. Beehive fragments are weird. They're kind of ceramic bands that have check marks scratched into them. And you can see what they would have looked like in the bottom there. So they're basically like a bucket sideways, and then you put these rings onto the end of the bucket, and the bees attach the hive to the rings. And the thinking there is you could take the rings off to extract honey without destroying a hive, which is quite useful. So we found hundreds, if not thousands of these things. And it led me to think, well, what's going on here? This is a big repeated pattern. So then we can turn to ancient texts. So we got pottery telling us one thing. We got survey showing us where these things are occurring. And ancient texts tell us about ancient wine. So we have an ancient Roman author talking about passum, which is a type of Cretan wine, and what it's good for. And this is Dioscorides. He talks about wine being good for sore eyes, sore ears, headaches, expelling worms. If you ever had sweet wine, which this we think was, it's not good for headaches. You can trust me on this. This is part of my lived experience. We have a quote then from Galen, who's a very famous physician, talking about glycos kritikos, which is like a sweet Cretan wine. So it's a sweet wine that they were thinking about. In the ancient world, they didn't differentiate white and red. They differentiated sweet and savory. But then we have this really interesting quote from Pliny, who's an ancient Roman author who writes about everything. He is like the greatest mansplainer in the history of the universe. He has an opinion on everything. But he's talking here about honey and wine. And he talks about the raisin wine of Crete being the best. And then he talks about the Greeks have given this wine the name of stika, and we call it apiana. Apiana is interesting. This word is connected to like apiculture and bees. So this is an interesting thing. Now, Pliny is a Roman author writing for a Roman audience. Even though Knossos is in Greece, he's writing during the Roman period. So it gets a little bit confusing, but it is sort of, to all intents and purposes, a Roman site at this point. So this reference to bees and is interesting to me, apiana. And this makes me think that maybe what they were doing with the honey amphora connection is either using honey to sweeten wine or using wax to insulate their amphoras and use it as a sealant. We know examples of this from Georgia, the country Georgia, where they've been doing this for centuries as well. So could be a sealant. I suspect probably it's for sweetening wine. You can make raisin wine, which is sweet, but if you've ever bought a bottle of Amarone, it's expensive. If you want to do an Amarone on the cheap, you might just huck a little bit of honey in, swish it around and sell it to someone in Rome, and hopefully they don't have a receipt. So I think that's what was happening with the Cretan wine. Now that led me to another rabbit hole, which was, and I'll wrap up here in a few minutes, which is about wine making at Knossos. So then I started working on this wine production facility. And this is ever so slightly earlier than the amphoras, maybe a generation or two earlier. This is the 2nd century BC, but toward the end of it. And this is, again, is something that was excavated but not published. So I had access to this data and I could just look at it and kind of work through it. And what we have here is a wine production facility. It's a little bit hard to see from the photos, but basically we have a pressing area, a large tank for collecting the grape juice, and then a fermentation vessel just below it. So the wine would have been made in three kind of steps. You squeeze the juice sits in primary fermentation for maybe a week, then you put it in for secondary fermentation into these half-buried vessels. So we have that. But what got me more interested in just thinking about making wine was quantities and what can we do with that? So that wine press had a capacity of about 1,400 liters, right? We have estimates that the average wine consumption in Rome by Roman people was somewhere between 70 to 180 liters a year. So quite a lot of wine. It would have been mostly diluted, so they wouldn't have been drunk all the time, but certainly some of the time. Now, by those numbers, a single tank from this would meet enough wine for 7 to 20 adults for a year. So this is not very much, but they would reuse presses throughout the year. So you'd usually get 7 to 9 presses in a season out of wine, which now gives us around 10 to 12,000 liters of wine a year, which is a lot. Now that gives us about enough wine to fill an amphora, a ship full of amphoras, so about 500 amphorae, or enough wine to meet the needs of kind of 54 to 180 adults, depending on your estimates. So like it's quite a lot. This wine press has become really important because it's one of the best examples of a wine press in ancient Greece. But those numbers aren't very big, so I'm inclined to think it's not very important. Now, this is the last thing I want to say before I kind of talk about the future directions here. But so this is something that I've tried to do, thinking about survey, pottery, capacity, modeling, looking at ethnographic research, so examples of wine production in Syria in slightly more modern times, to think about this. And I've come to basically understand that this wine press probably would have required slightly less than 5 hectares of land to meet the needs that it was producing every year. So not very much. The size of Knossos at the time when the wine press was operating was about 120 hectares. So that's the urban area. There's probably double or triple the size if you think peri-urban and kind of production. So quite big. So they would have had enough land for that. And based on population estimates we've done, we reckon very conservative estimates of 17 to 20,000 people were living in the city at the time. So it sounds like a lot, but when you consider that wine press was giving you enough wine so at a maximum of 180 adults, suddenly this thing is very sobering. This important wine press is suddenly not very important. There's probably 50 of these operating in the city. So it's the evidence that we have, and that requires kind of modeling and mapping out and thinking about how these things work. So my future directions, and this is, I promise, just the end here, are thinking about ancient honey production. I want to look more at yields of honey, how this works and what people were using it for. Were they actually sweetening wine? Is my dodgy theory correct? Or is it they were using it for something else? I want to start thinking about quantifying pottery production. We've got a whole series of pottery kilns. How many pots do you need to sustain a population? What do people need for cooking? What do people need for storage? And how much can you fire across a firing season for pottery, which is not very long either. I want to think about ethnographic examples of wood harvesting, ancient crop yields, and then the recycling of olive lees. When you press olives to get the oil out, you're left with this kind of sludge. The sludge is an excellent combustible material that was used in ancient heating, and they certainly used it in pottery production in more modern times. So I want to think about recycling and trying to understand that. Think about land requirements for the other elements of the Mediterranean triad, the cornerstone of the Mediterranean diet. So olives and wheat, in addition to grapes that we've already talked about. And then just think about settlement patterns. So I have this odd thing that I haven't had time to talk about, but it sort of fits with this wider picture of thinking about cities more holistically. When economy seems to spike in cities and agricultural production seems to spike, the size of cities seems to reduce. And there's something really weird happening. It's either maybe a busier countryside or more dense settlement occupation. I'm not really sure what it is yet. This is something I'm going to work on, but this actually, I think, probably has some hopeful ramification for thinking about our own kind of world today. But thank you. Sorry, hope I haven't gone over time. But thanks.